I'm here today to talk about public sector workers, and I've just been interviewed by the media. Didn't quite expect that, but happy to do it. And then one of the things they asked me was a conflict of interest, if I have a conflict of interest, because technically, I guess, professors are public sector workers, and certainly they're included in my data here. I just want to assure you there's no conflict of interest. I think I'm trying to be objective in what I do, and I didn't know what the data were going to say or how I would interpret them before they were kind of analyzed when I crunched the numbers. And so if I have to take a cut in my pay, and that's what I recommend, I'll do that. But the integrity of what I'm going to say is much more important than anything that could happen to me personally. I just want to be clear about that. So anyway, so I guess the question is, are public sector workers better off in Alberta than in the other provinces? And we've been seeing a lot about this lately, a lot of heat and not a lot of light on the topic, right? And here's some of the things, you know, I've just sort of cut out of web pages, cut and pasted these. Hundreds of voiced concerns over Alberta public sector cuts during town hall. This was in Edmonton. We just had a town hall here a couple weeks ago as well. Some of you may have attended. I did not. I didn't have the strength to do so. Battle escalates in Alberta between unions, Jason Kenney government over layoff threats. This is a big concern. I was up in Ottawa. What's the other place? Edmonton, that's the place. A few weeks ago, of course, talking to a lot of public sector union people, and they're very concerned with what's going on. They sort of very much view this as an attack on them, very ideological, without any sort of firm basis in they might say reality, I don't know what I would call it. But they're very concerned, of course, that they're sort of on the front lines and they're being attacked. The Blue Ribbon Panel report came out, as Colleen said, at the beginning of September. And we pretty much knew what it was going to say. I mean, one hand was tied behind the back of the panel because they couldn't deal with the revenue side, only the expenditure side. And of course, public sector workers take a large share of the provincial budget in terms of its expenditures. So there was no doubt in our minds, of course, that the public sector workers would come under fire in all of this, okay? And I think this also speaks to Kenney's base, but I won't go there. So here's another thing. Lethbridge residents protest Alberta budget. It's not just about bad policy. This is about being misled. The budget, in fact, was, I really don't know what the government was thinking in a lot of ways. They must think we're really uneducated or something, and that we can't read, and that we don't understand the effects of inflation and population growth on public expenditures. Because, of course, Kenney came out and he said in the election campaign there'd be no cuts to frontline services, and he was, okay, maybe technically correct about that, but he's not giving anybody any increases. And of course, we still have inflation, we still have population growth, more kids going to school, the elderly population going to be utilizing more healthcare services, et cetera, et cetera. So that was very misleading, definitely, what they said. On the other side, you got, I think this is from the Edmonton Sun, saying the UCP rightfully scaling back the public sector gravy train. It's a gravy train. And you can see a little gravy dripping off of me right now, I'm sure. Okay. And according to Kenney, says not the arrival of the apocalypse, okay, as labor anger grows. So we sort of have, people on both sides here. And I think in Alberta, of course, a lot of people, I talked to some of my students, a lot of students, of course, at the University of Lethbridge come from rural areas, and they talk about public servants to their families, and they think that public servants are just nothing but a drain and a waste and things like that. And I don't think that's true at all. I would like to think as a public servant, I suppose, that I do, add some value to this province in what I do, and as most of my colleagues do at the university as well. So, BRP is just the Blue Ribbon Panel. They tried to show both the size, I'll put that in there, both the size of the public sector and its compensation are out of control. This is right from the Blue Ribbon Panel report. But their report showed that public sector growth equaled population growth under the NDP. So if you kind of look at those numbers there, I think you can see them good. They sort of highlight those things, right? You sort of think in the context of a shrinking economy, these numbers might, kind of stand out for a lot of people who've lost their jobs. They're going, well, geez, the private sector shrunk by, thousands of workers and whatever percentage over the time, and yet the public sector continues to grow so these numbers don't look too big, but in the context of a shrinking private sector, they might look fairly large. But if you kind of crunch the numbers like I did, it's pretty easy calculation. Cumulative increase of 5.5%, which is exactly the same increase in the population over this period of time. So this is during the NDP government, right? These numbers were right out of the NDP's last budget. Okay, I believe. Marie's sitting here. I'm a little bit intimidated, but I think they're right. Okay. The same thing with compensation. We can sort of take a look at some of these numbers here and look at this average growth of compensation, 2.3% for workers in the public sector. But then again, if you kind of crunch the numbers, you look at a cumulative increase of 12.1%, but inflation and population growth increased by 12.2% over the same period. So I think, I mean, my way of thinking, this is pretty responsible, the way it's been budgeted anyway by the previous government. I really don't have a problem with this, and in fact, if anything, they might have stimulated the economy a little bit more earlier on in the period when, of course, the private sector and oil prices were going south. So I don't really have a problem with this. I think it's pretty reasonable what's going on here. So what's the problem? And I'll put some numbers up here, and I got some charts here. Since 2004, real public PS's public sector earnings have been stable while overall earnings have decreased. So if you look at the, I'll put something else in here just to give you a little graphic here. So I'm very proud of that. I did that all by myself, can you tell? Yeah, okay. I was really good with crayons too. If you look at the blue line there, second from the top, that's sort of that's overall weekly earnings in real terms. So those are inflation-adjusted earnings from 2001 all the way to 2018, and the black line there's at 2014. That's when things went south in Alberta, right? Or started to go south. That's that summer. That's when oil prices started to plummet, and of course over a little bit longer period of time to 2015 is when a lot of the layoffs started, up in Fort Mac and across the province, and that all filtered through the economy, of course. But so the blue line's overall. That includes everybody in the economy. I couldn't just tease out the private sector workers in these data, but they've gone down. Right, they've gone down since 2014. Again, these are inflation adjusted, so they've gone down. Whereas if you sort of look at the yellow line is people in public administration. So these are the people at City Hall or up in Edmonton in the ministries, or even federal government workers who happen to be working in Alberta as well, okay? And it's pretty flat in real terms since 2014. A little bit of an uptick there, which is nothing major, I suppose. And then the what is that, orange line, I guess? Orange to me anyway, second from the bottom there. That's educational services, pretty flat. Earnings in real terms, again, inflation-adjusted earnings. And then the bottom one is healthcare and social services. This doesn't include physicians, okay? Physicians are kind of special in a lot of ways, the way they're compensated. They usually have professional corporations, and these are people that work for wages, basically. People who collect a paycheck, okay? So most physicians aren't included in there. There's a few that are gonna find their way in there, but very few. Anyway, it's all kind of flat, right? At least maybe you have a different interpretation, but the problem here basically is that this gives the appearance of inflated public sector wages in a lot of ways. And I'll just sort of put some arrows. I did those myself too. These are sort of, the three arrows show 2016, 2017, and 2018, okay? And so that gap's become bigger, right? And it's not because, public sector wages have gone up, it's because private sector wages have gone down, so the gap looks bigger, right? And so if you read the Blue Ribbon Panel report and the budget and all those kinds of things, they're usually looking at 2016, 2017, or 2018, and using this as a comparator. And I'm going, well, it's probably not a good time to compare, right? Because the private sector was doing so poorly at the time. And that's exactly sort of what they do in that report there. In terms of the size of the public sector, it's not unusual as a percentage of the population. I put a couple little things. Alberta's yellow in there, and this compared, one of the favorite things the McKinnon report and the budget likes to do, and Kenny constantly talks about, is how we compare to other provinces. Okay, and this is something I have an issue with in a lot of ways. There's certainly some government workers, they might go to other provinces if they were to be cut back here. I mean, in essence, most of the nurses and, teachers, et cetera, are public servants. There's some in the private sector as well. So if there are massive cutbacks to a lot of these people, of course, they may not have any other option but to leave the province. Okay, whereas a lot of others, well, if you're admin support or something like that, or if you're, a custodian or all these other sort of public sector workers, you're not likely to pack up and move from Edmonton to Regina or something like that, looking for greener pastures or Victoria or something like that because they cut your wages. You're more likely to go across the street and get a job, somewhere else in the private sector or in the public sector for that matter. So the Blue Ribbon Panel report talks a whole lot about the differences between the provinces, and something I kind of, in the context of, we're going to be losing people, blah, blah, blah. And I don't necessarily agree with that. So anyway. That's sort of parenthetically stated. What I want to get here with the black circles show is the size of the public sector as a percentage of the population. This goes back all the way to 1976, so it goes back a long time. And the size of the public sector today is about the same as it was back in 1976. as a percentage of the population, right? We can quibble about these figures a little bit. There's a lot of nuances there. You can sort of see this big uptick when the NDP came in. The yellow line kind of goes up from quite a bit, well, half a percent, what, about a percentage point, from 9% or something to, I guess you can't see if I point at the screen here. But it goes from about 9% of the population up to about 10%. Again, this was kind of a thing to do. I mean, part of the problem here is the denominator is going down as well, right? The population growth in Alberta wasn't as great following 2014 as it was previous to that. Okay, we can also show it in terms of total employment here. It's a slightly different metric, but so the trend is down, right? So from 1976, about 22% of total employees were involved in the public sector. Okay, and that went down to what, about 18%? I can't really read this. So it went down by quite a bit. A lot of things happened, of course, in that period, right? I've been sort of trying to think about what's going on recently in terms of what happened in the 1990s with Ralph Klein, and so I've been kind of reading up on that, and I didn't actually live in Alberta during those years, so I don't remember it firsthand, but it's pretty interesting, a lot of the parallels between 1993, 94, and today with the Ralph Klein government in a fairly big way. So, I mean, of course, a lot of things did happen in the labor market over this period of time. I remember Ralph came in and privatized liquor stores and registries and things like that, right? But what ultimately saved Ralph, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, again, what we've sort of done here is compare the size of the public sector in Alberta compared to other jurisdictions, and with the exception of that kind of uptick over the last 4 years or so, there's really nothing outstanding about Alberta, right? I don't think we stand out in any way in terms of the size of our public sector, right? Compared to these other comparators. Now, what we really have to do, and what I've done in here, is take a look at, this is the Consumer Price Index from where are we? From 2001 to 2018. And we have to recognize, too, that inflation in Alberta has been a lot higher, and I'll put a handy little oval in there for you to look at. It's been quite a bit higher than, over this period of time than other jurisdictions, and that certainly has to be reflected in the wages and the earnings in this province, okay? And this is something that's not taken into consideration sometimes. And so that's what I do. So from what happens from here on in, and what I've said before, I correct for inflation. I use inflation-adjusted earnings and wages, okay? Which is the fair thing to do, and that's what economists always do with these types of things. Money itself doesn't mean anything unless you sort of deflate it by inflation. Anyway, so these are relative earnings. This is for all industries in Alberta, and I'll kind of explain this for those of you who aren't too comfortable with charts. If the big black line, or the horizontal black line there, is sort of par. So earnings, if they're at that black line between Alberta and other provinces, would be at par. If we're below that line, as it says there, relative earnings are going to be lower in Alberta. So what I'm doing is comparing earnings in Alberta with earnings in these other provinces. Okay? If they're above this black line at the 1.00 there, that means relative earnings in Alberta are higher than they are in other provinces. So this is for everybody in the economy, everybody, who works for wages, or earning, or salaries, whatever the case may be. And so if you kind of take a look here, even today, earnings overall are between 7 and 12 percentage points higher, okay, or 12% higher compared to the other jurisdictions, okay? The orange line at the top is Quebec. Okay, Quebec has this huge public sector that's not terribly well paid, okay, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But anyway, but compared to the other provinces, and the lines below the orange line there show for British Columbia, Ontario, and then Canada overall, about 7% higher wages overall in Alberta, or earnings, excuse me, compared to the rest of the country, or these other jurisdictions anyway, which is much smaller than if you sort of go back to 2004, you kind of go a little bit left there, where those lines peak, about 15% higher. So we're still doing okay in Alberta overall when it comes to wages. So now what we want to do is, I want to put this in the context, okay, this is what the overall economy or labor market kind of looks like in terms of earnings. What do specific public sector kind of industries look like? And here we have educational services. Okay, so here's educational services, and if again go to 2018, which are the most recent yearly data available, so Quebec, we have slightly higher earnings in this sector compared to Quebec, but actually below compared to the other comparators, which are Canada, British Columbia, and Ontario. So we're not looking too good in terms of educational services, and there's a lot of nuance. These are just raw data, so I'll talk about that in a second again. But just looking at these numbers, and why I sort of crunched the numbers this way was to make them comparable to the McKinnon report as much as I could at the time, okay? And what's been written previously by Janice McKinnon as well. So this is educational services. So these are not only your teachers, of course, your educational assistants, this would be anybody in that industry. So, everybody from the principal, presumably, down to, the whatever, or down or across, I guess you could say, to the custodians and, people running the cafeterias, what have you. Okay. This is for healthcare and social assistance. And again, we sort of see a little bit higher in Alberta, but not much compared to these other jurisdictions. Okay. And again, this is a lot of people in here. These would be your LPNs, your RNs would be your, your social workers, things like that, in these types of things. And again, all the way to people working in the cafeteria and custodians and what have you. So they're about the same. I don't see any really cause for concern here. This is for public administration. Again, with the exception of Quebec, nothing really striking there. Pretty much at or below par with the rest of these jurisdictions, at least recently. I think what's interesting too, if you kind of go left, here, yeah, left, you see these numbers are always below par. So we had a lot of years there when a lot of these people were making less than presumably comparable people in other jurisdictions. And I don't remember back in 2001, 2002, 2003, anybody complaining about those poor public sector workers that were underpaid. I could be wrong, but I don't recall that discussion happening here at all. Okay. Here's relative weekly earnings. Here's federal public administration. Again, we can break down the public sector into federal, provincial, and local. And federally, federal workers don't seem to do too well in Alberta compared to the other provinces. And I suspect that's because federally, they set the pay scales federally. And of course, as we all know, living in Alberta, or at least according to some people in Alberta, we're chronically ignored here. So I doubt they take our sort of higher inflation rate and all that other things, all those other good things into consideration when they set pay scales. They're likely set, of course, they're set in Ottawa. And I suspect that's what's going on there if I had to speculate without digging a little bit deeper. If we look at the provincial government employees, excuse me, sort of the same thing here. Quebec's up there. Alberta public administration, provincial employees don't stand out in any dramatic way. You could quibble with the way I interpret these data, but I don't see anything too jumping off the page. Anybody here a local government worker? Brace yourself. There's where the issue seems to be, if any. Again, this is pretty simple analysis here, but here's, again, the provincial, do I put it? Yeah, there we go. So these are the local government workers. So these are the people, these are the city hall people, okay? And they seem to be doing pretty well in Alberta compared to elsewhere. And I won't say anything about Lethbridge. Of course, this is going to be weighted heavily towards Calgary and Edmonton because they're so much larger than we are. So don't lynch me if you used to be a city worker or a city worker or whatever. But that seems to be where issues are. And again, I think it's worth digging at a little bit deeper and sort of like, if there's going to be sort of cuts, I suppose, anywhere. And of course, this is what's interesting too, is that these people are outside of the control of the provincial government, right? They're the people who work at the city. Now, of course, indirectly, the province can have an impact on these people by changing the grants given to the cities, I suppose. But they don't have direct control over the salaries of these people or in negotiations or anything. So that seems to be where worthy of taking a closer look at those types of data. Here again, I just kind of sliced the data a little bit differently. So up here, so again, sort of pretty much shows what we do. A wage tends to be a better measure of productivity than earnings, right? So I did it by wage too, the last 3 years or so. And again, you can kind of see, of course, the private sector earnings tend to be much higher than the public sector earnings, and you kind of weight those and average them out, and you get the line at the top there, all industries. Now, this is pretty simple analysis, right? We're not really controlling for anything. There can be differences, of course, statistically when it comes to, different levels of education and different occupations and all those kind of mixtures between the sectors. So when I do that, I do a more sophisticated analysis I'll talk about a little bit later. I find that public sector workers in Alberta had hourly wages averaging about 3.7% higher in industries that contain both public and private sector workers over the 2006 to 2017 period. So it's important, basically, a lot of people, there's no overlap, right? If you work for public administration, that's its own industry. There's nothing comparable in the private sector, okay? But every other industry does have public sector workers and private sector workers, right? And they spill over. I mean, even universities, there's some private universities in Alberta that have professors. There's, nurses work for private organizations sometimes. Teachers work for private schools in the Weber Academy or what have you. So there is a lot of overlap there. And so when I kind of do that analysis over this time period, 2006 to 2017, it shows 3.7% higher on average. That's an average again. And a lot of people would say, public sector workers in particular, that they're the cream of the crop, okay? And I think there's some truth to that. It's worthy of investigating further as well, and there's been some evidence out there to say that. Certainly when I worked in Ottawa, every time when there was a job opening there were probably 100 applicants for the job. We see that at the university all the time, hundreds of applicants for one opening. That's a pretty good position to be in if you're an employer. You can really get the cream of the crop that way, And the same could be said for other jobs as well in the public sector. So this could be an artifact of higher productivity amongst public sector workers on average, and not any, overpayment or gravy or whatever, the media has been pointing out here. So it's worth thinking about a little further, I think. So what happens next? Migration of Alberta's public servants. Here's some stuff out of the media again. Rural doctors worry proposed changes could lead to brain drain. Okay. PEI healthcare recruiters. This blew me away. The Maritimes are coming to Alberta to recruit. Okay. How many years have we been going to the Maritimes to recruit? All right. And so there's pickings. As introduced in my bio, when Ralph Klein was in power here, I was doing my graduate work at the University of Texas, and we had a Canadian club on campus in and around Austin, Texas, and it was full of Canadians. Okay, and a lot of them were, of course, not just graduate students at the time, but there were teachers and nurses and people that really, really wanted to stay in Canada, but they couldn't. Okay, there were no jobs there, and I was certainly part of that too. My first academic job was not in Canada, and as soon as they sort of turned on the taps again in the early 2000s, that's when I came back to Canada. But certainly, this could be going on again. I'll talk about that more in a second again. What else can we do? Wait for energy prices to rebound as they did during the Klein years, and then wait for more Ralph bucks to come rolling in. You remember your $400 check back in, what was it, 2003 or something? 2002, was it? Your $400 check? You don't remember that? You do remember that, yeah. I mean, anyway, I won't buy me a beer and I'll tell you what I really think about that. But here's what happened in the Klein years too. I mean, look at the price of oil, rebounded, big time. This is what really saved Ralph, okay, in a lot of ways. And if we kind of go forward one slide, here are the Klein years again, and let me put a couple circles there. Again, it's kind of a little bit messy, but if you can see the yellow line there, this is the same slide I showed before, but kind of just sort of condensed into the Ralph Klein years. And if you look at the yellow line there in the two circles, it's basically the same level, a little bit lower back in 2000. Ralph was premier till what, end of 2006? I have 5 minutes? Oh, I thought that was my score out of 10, 5, okay. Okay. Yeah, I should be able to do this. This really, I mean, everybody thinks Ralph was the cuts happened, and they did happen. They happened across the country, as you can see from here, right? But they also rebounded in Alberta pretty healthy, and that's largely because of this increase in the price of oil. So Ralph kind of backed off, the budget was balanced, and of course, big fanfare, and then the Ralph bucks came, and everybody was good, and et cetera. What else can we do? Well, here's one thing I'll talk about this more in a second here in the 4.5 minutes I have left now. We can enhance government revenues beyond natural resource revenues to pay for these government services. This is really an unpopular thing. This is code word for sales tax, provincial sales tax, okay? And me and Trevor Harrison's one of my co-authors. He's also from the University of Lethbridge. He's talked here several times. We just wrote something with Bob Askup at the University of Alberta on this. I'll talk about that in a second again. Basically recommending a sales tax, okay? But basically, if you can sort of see this thing here, the line below zero there shows that there was never been a balanced budget in Alberta all the way from 1986 to present if we extract natural resource revenues out of the revenue side. Never. We've never balanced the budget, let alone had a surplus. Okay? And in fact, in our report, we take those numbers all the way back to 1966. So in my little shorter than my lifetime, we've never had a balanced budget in Alberta when we strip out natural resource revenues. We depend too much on natural resource revenues. And even the Parliamentary Budget Office questions these things, questions Alberta's government's fiscal strategy in all of this. And a lot of that has to do with the revenue side. If you take a good look at the revenue side, our revenue per capita is really low in this province. Okay, it's really low, okay? And a lot of that is because we don't have a sales tax in place, and we depend on these natural resource revenues to drag us out of all our problems. And if those don't come back, we're in big trouble. What we can do, we can hope the UCP backs off its attack on the public sector in its next budget. Of course, this came out the last few days, the slipping popularity. I think there's been 3 polls released or something in the last few days, and they all basically say the same thing about the popularity for the UCP really going down. So maybe Kenny, being a political animal, might back off a bit. I don't know. I don't know the man. Who knows? But again, his approval ratings have plummeted in the wake of these Alberta budget cuts. People didn't vote for this, right? So here's some takeaway messages. There's many inappropriate comparisons of public sector earnings used by the Blue Ribbon panel and then again by the UCP. I mean, this was just so predictable what was going to happen. You didn't even have to pick up the newspaper and read the budget because you knew what it was going to say, right? Pretty much. So, second bullet, we need to take into consideration Alberta's higher inflation rate and the higher private sector earnings. Those are important, right? Again, people, it's going to be the private sector in Alberta that sucks away these public sector employees if their wages are cut too much. Okay, and that's where the sort of things are. They're not going to change provinces. And so Alberta's just a high wage place. We have been for a lot of years. We've exceeded the national average in terms of average earnings, weekly earnings for years now, of course. And we want to, and that rising tide should lift the public sector workers as well as the private sector workers, presumably. Third point, the public sector size and level of compensation doesn't seem out of whack compared to any of the other jurisdictions, at least in my opinion. If you start comparing to New Brunswick or something, yeah, we'd be really out of whack. I mean, it's a much different kind of case in situation in those provinces, smaller provinces. Wages are somewhat higher than in the private sector. Again, my best guess is about 3.7%. Alberta's entering a new normal, I call it, and resource revenues cannot be counted on. And a lot of firms right now are really working hard to get that stuff out of the ground before it becomes worthless. And it's, I think in my lifetime it will become worthless. What's the implications of all this? Any cuts must be done to avoid compromising public services. Some of the people I talked to at the university that were there in the mid-1990s when some of the cuts came said, I guess they didn't notice any difference amongst faculty. Their job didn't change at all. In fact, in some ways, their jobs probably became easier because the fewer kind of administrators you have in any organization, and I'm not pointing the finger at the university, the fewer administrators you have, probably the less paperwork you have, and that gets filtered down to the faculty level, to students, you name it. And certainly a lot of people I knew that were in there in the 1990s thought the cuts that happened were not a bad thing in terms of their job function. I didn't mention this, but cuts are going to tend to penalize those at the top of the pay scale. There's sort of a compressed wage earnings distribution in the public sector. Those at the bottom and in the middle kind of do pretty well, compared to their comparators in the private sector. Those at the top don't do too well, right? People, a lot of us presumably, could go into the private sector and make a lot more money. A new brain drain. And out of the mid-1990s. And again, I don't think oil prices are going to save us this time. And this is a real possibility. What's different between now and the 1990s is that other jurisdictions aren't cutting back on their public sector in Canada like they were in the 1990s. Okay? And so public sector workers here have better options within Canada, and most Canadians don't want to leave the country, especially now going south, I suspect. That's not a real attractive option for a lot of Canadians, okay? The ripple effects throughout the Alberta economy, we have to think about overall employment, tax revenues, economic growth. I'm a public servant, but I pay taxes, right? This is kind of an interesting thought exercise. How much do I actually cost the taxpayer once you net out my taxes? It's a little bit less than what I'm being paid, right? Whatever my marginal tax rate is, blah, blah, blah. We could figure that one out, okay? So certainly economic growth. And again, I think the NDP government did a reasonable job in all this. I can quibble about a few things. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But by and large, I think they did the right thing by stimulating the economy at the time, exactly the time it needed to be stimulated. And then lastly, the province is downloading budget cuts to taxpayers and to municipalities. Here's the thing too, right? You didn't vote for this. You're paying more to send your kids to school on the bus, right? Your income tax, your tax rates aren't being indexed, your marginal tax rates in Alberta anymore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All this stuff is going to be downloaded to us. It's going to be downloaded to the municipalities too. It already is, okay? So don't swallow this nonsense that your taxes are being, or things are all okay and nothing's changing. 1 minute, okay. And just for complete shameless self-promotion here. If you want to read more about this, these two papers were released by opposite ends of the political spectrum, I guess, probably in October. Both of these I did. The one on the left is from the Parkland Institute. You can just go to parklandinstitute.org, I think, and find it there. And the other one's the School of Public Policy at UC. That's the more technical paper. But then in terms of the Blue Ribbon Panel report, this is the report I did with Trevor Harrison, who's in the Sociology Department at U of L, and Bob Askup at U of A. We tried to get this report out at the same time as the Blue Ribbon Panel report and we're about a week late. And part of that is because we had to change tenses. But anyway, this will give you a better idea about what we think about sort of the broader budget. And I think I'm done. So thank you.